Across human history, we've looked to the heavens and seen things that didn't make sense. Today's guest chronicles how those human experiences were translated in the aftermath of the Second World War into the UFO phenomena we still talk about today. He's Greg Eghigian, this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University.
And I'm G. Wayne Miller, also with Salve's Pell Center.
Our guest this week is Greg Eghigian, a professor of history at Penn State University. He's also the author of a provocative new book, After the Flying Saucers Came, A Global History of the UFO Phenomenon. He joins us today from Pennsylvania. Greg, it's so great to have you with us, and congratulations on what is really a tremendous piece of scholarship. For folks who haven't read it yet, do you want to give us a quick overview of After the Flying Saucers Came?
Sure. Thanks for having me here today. What I look at in the book is a sort of history of our, let's say, our more recent engagement with and our maybe even our obsession with this prospect that we're being visited by aliens, by extraterrestrials. A phenomenon, a kind of a social and cultural phenomenon that begins in the late 40s and of course still continues to this very day.
You know, so the scope and the scale of your scholarship is absolutely tremendous. Just the sources and your footnotes are absolutely staggering. Tell us a little bit about how did you access all of these sources, and how long did the research actually take?
Research took a long time. I'd say I'd been working on this project for a good 10 years at least. It wasn't simple at first, I would say. So one of the things I discovered right away when I started to take this on was something that surprised me. And I had a lot of surprises along the way, but one of the earliest and biggest surprises was to find out that there had only been one book by one academic historian who ever written a history on this subject, and that was back in 1975. Normally, that's a really great opportunity for a historian to say, I'm going to jump right in there. But of course, it also meant I kind of didn't have a guide. I needed some sort of direction. And so what I had to do was to figure out the first thing, as you point out, that every historian has to do. Where am I going to find my sources? Especially with material that of course, tends to be stuff that doesn't last very long, newsletters, correspondence, major government archives, major university archives don't tend to keep this stuff around. So I didn't know what to do about that. And then what I found out was the next big surprise was by talking to people who've been UFO researchers, ufologists, and particularly veterans who've been around for several decades. I found out that in fact, ufologists never throw away any. They are natural archivists. They keep it all. And so there's enormous amount of material that I utilized, and particularly one spectacular archive in Sweden, of all places, in a place called Norrköping, a group of veteran ufologists who've been preserving material from all over the world for decades. It's a staggering amount of material. I certainly couldn't, cover all of it. But that was really the beginning. And from there, I just saw more and more material and had access to more and more material.
Well, we're going to get into the heart of the book in just a moment. But you said something that sort of, captures my attention. Only one other book by an academic historian before yours, published 40 years ago. Did that give you pause? Like, was there a reason why academic historians? I mean, you can go into any bookstore and there's an entire section of books dedicated to UFOs and paranormal phenomena. did it give you pause diving into these particular waters?
It didn't give me pause, but it added another mystery to the mystery of UFOs. The mystery being, why were historians so absent? We're a pretty curious community. We study just about everything and anything you can imagine, and particularly phenomena, social phenomenon that kind of preoccupy the world. You would think it would have been something that a bunch of historians would have gotten into by now. And particularly strange is the fact that when you do some digging, you find out that UFOs have been studied by psychologists, psychiatrists, folklorists, literary scholars, religious study scholars, sociology. You can go down a litany of different kind of academic groups. So it was a mystery, and to some extent it still remains a mystery to me, because one of course, the problems with something not happening is very few people talk about why they didn't do something, right? So I still am a bit, left at a loss for figuring out why that was never the case. But that's been a great opportunity for me then, I guess.
So, Greg, in writing this, you play it right down the middle. You do not endorse nor discredit the concept, the idea, the possibility that there are extraterrestrials or non-human life out there. Why did you decide to take that middle ground?
Yeah, that was very important for me. I mean, when I began the project, I knew right away I needed to make a very critical decision about how I was going to approach this subject. And it seemed to me that one of the things that defined how this phenomenon has been talked about over the decades is that there's been kind of two positions, right? And the two positions, of course, is the kind of true believer who absolutely convinced that these are extraterrestrial visitors or visitors from another dimension or something supernatural. And then on the other hand, you have these diehard debunkers who, of course, consider it to be nonsense or optical illusions or atmospheric phenomena. And in a sense, what they both share is almost a kind of forensic detective approach to this, right? That we're going to find out if this is true or not. It struck me that if I come at this like historians do with so many other subjects, which is to say, I'm not here to referee that issue. I'm not going to adjudicate it. I'm here to understand how people have tried to make sense of it and have sought truth or falsity in all of this. And if I do that, I'm going to see things that we don't normally see. And I hope that I've succeeded in that, and that it is a position that is an unusual one, but it affords us real opportunities to maybe see things that we would normally neglect or ignore or just simply look over and pass over.
So the cultural context here obviously is really super important. Stories of strange flying objects began to emerge in the late 1940s, which was, the aftermath of World War II and the Cold War. Talk about that. Was that fertile ground for this whole topic to grow, this whole international discussion, both sides?
Yeah, it was critical. I mean, I don't think we can think about and understand the UFO phenomenon as we think about it today without the Cold War, the specter of the Cold War. It was there at the beginning, and it really haunts the story of UFOs throughout its entire history. But the other thing, and you're quite right about, that I think often gets neglected is the importance of World War II as well. Because, of course, when strange objects, flying objects, are seen in the skies just a couple years after World War II, and this is not only in the United States, it's in Europe as well, people have a memory, and it's not a distant memory, it's the recent past, right, of seeing technologically advanced weapons and aircraft, right, overhead. You have V rockets, right, that are fired on the UK and that land in Scandinavia. You have the atomic bomb, right, exploded, and atomic testing after World War II, right? You have new kinds of aircraft as well. So all of these things are there as part of the story. And so when this flying saucer phenomenon starts to take shape in the summer of 1947, really the first ideas and speculation about this must be another variation on this theme. This must be some sort of new military technology on the part of really the only two nations capable of it, the Soviet Union or the United States. And so right from the start, that's kind of folded into the story. And interestingly enough, the Cold War and World War II are also folded into the UFO story about aliens, because when people start to bring this idea up that these could be extraterrestrials, what happens is they are asked a question, which seems a legitimate question, a historical question. Why now? Why are the aliens visiting us now of all times? And the explanation they give is it seems to be the cause of this seems to have been the fact that the aliens saw our atomic bomb explosions and realized we had reached some sort of stage in civilization, in advancement of technoscience that made us now interesting or perhaps even problematic. So even in those narratives, you see the Cold War inserted into those stories.
So today, speaking of war, we have incredible tension in the Middle East. We have Ukraine. Has that context brought out more interest, more writing about UFOs?
Well, it seems to me that what we see over the decades is that conflict per se, I don't think brings about, or we see any really compelling evidence to indicate that sort of ignites or inspires UFO sightings or UFO reports per se. What does seem to me to have some impact is the development of new technologies, particularly military technologies. So one of the things I know from talking with veteran ufologists is that, for instance, the development and proliferation of drones, for instance, has absolutely sparked more sightings, more reports. They get inundated with more as more and more drones are utilized by private citizens, right? So things like that seem to have more of an impact than actual sort of conflicts or even blockbuster movies. I think that's another sort of suspicion that people have, is that if Spielberg or somebody, Ridley Scott, comes out with a new alien movie, we're going to start seeing a lot more sightings. And that also doesn't seem to be the case.
That's fascinating. Well, so let's go to some of the grounding folklore of the phenomena. Let's go to Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1952, where a series of sightings sort of impact the way the public viewed the phenomena itself. To the extent that you could explain what happened in D.C. that summer, tell us what happened, but then tell us also about the impact of those sightings on the broader community.
Yeah, so in 1952, in the summer of 1952, there's over several weekends, there are quite a large number of sightings of UFOs over the city. It's often reported at the time that they were there hovering over the Capitol, as if, I guess, the UFOs were really particularly interested in Congress in some way. But in any event, they were also spotted by air traffic controllers. So radar also detected some very, very strange activities of these apparently craft, and fighter jets were sent out to sort of intercept them, though they never did. In any event, this gets a lot of press coverage. It gets a lot of press coverage in the United States. It gets a lot of press coverage throughout the world. The Air Force intelligence has to come out publicly and say what they think is going on here. They conclude that there's natural explanations for these things. There's nothing to worry about. There's no indication that national security is at risk. The 1952 sighting, though, it becomes, I think, really pivotal in certain ways, because what it does is it sort of lends a sense of danger to the UFO phenomenon, which had been there before. But this idea that there's a kind of a concentration, a flap, as what it would be called at the time, a flap of sightings all around the political headquarters, right, of the United States. That seemed to ring, I think, to many people a sense that there's something menacing here. And so it was easy to sort of fold this story and this kind of menacing element here into also then the beginnings of the conspiracy theory, the idea that the government maybe wasn't being honest with us, right? Wasn't being straight with us about what they knew.
So, following sightings came reports of close contact. People who claimed that they had exchanges with aliens, who had been abducted into an alien spaceship, the mothership, to use sort of a Spielbergian allusion here. Talk about that. I mean, that was a significant evolution. That it's one thing to claim you saw something. It's another thing to claim that you actually spoke with or had an actual personal encounter with somebody or something or some force not of the Earth.
Yeah, absolutely, and that it was seen that way at the time. So those claims start to come out and pop up around the early 1950s, and really sort of the first cohort, a group who really pop on the scene around 1952, 1953, and are sort of active and very prominent throughout the 60s, is a group that earned the name the contactees. And the contactees were very distinctive. I mean, the alien and the alien encounter that we think of today, right, this sort of bulbous-headed gray alien who abducts people at night and performs experiments on them, that really wasn't something that at all that was being discussed by the contactees. The contactees said they were meeting people who looked like us. They oftentimes were actually described as being absolutely beautiful and radiant and gorgeous and wise and kindly. They could speak our language. They had developed not only sophisticated technologies, but a superior morality here. And they said that what these aliens told them was that they were here to help us avoid mass extinction, to avoid nuclear holocaust. That story and that description changes over time. And really, over the course of the 70s and 80s, a whole other set of experiences are discussed, and people come forward who claim that, in fact, what they're encountering are not these sort of friendly, kindly, benevolent aliens, but in fact, creatures that are more monstrous, that are cold and unfeeling, that don't communicate, and that harm people. And so there's a kind of a darker side, and I talk about this a lot in the book, is the way in which the 70s and 80s brings in a sort of a darker set of elements to the story of UFOs.
Greg, what do you think explains that transformation, though, from those benign, brother aliens to the more menacing, they're here for something, scary stories that we get in the 80s and 90s?
Yeah, it's difficult to pinpoint any one thing, right? But again, what happens throughout the history of UFOs is, right, people inherently turn to kind of the mental tools that exist at any given time to make sense of it, right? The 50s and 60s saw a renaissance of New Age thought and New Age philosophy. So it perhaps is no surprise that these folks who believed that the turn of the millennium augured something really fantastic, something wonderful, and that we could sort of find inspiration in our new cosmic brothers and sisters, right? That sort of falls by the wayside by the 70s. And of course, if you remember or know your history of the 1970s, the 70s were a rough time. You have, particularly in the United States, you have an economic downturn and stagflation. You have the very end of the Vietnam War. You have Watergate and scandals galore. It's a really, really tough time. And it seems to me reflected in a lot of not just the UFO literature, but in a lot of the interest that happens during the 70s and early 80s in paranormal phenomena in general, which oftentimes were, as I say, took a kind of a dark spin about reality and about the future.
So in 2017, this most recent public focus on the UFO phenomena seems to have been reignited. Your book talks about sort of the declining interest in the 90s and in the first decade of the 2000s in the UFO phenomena, but it absolutely reignites and bursts back into public consciousness with investigative reporting from the New York Times and Politico, who break the story of a classified Pentagon program that has videotape evidence of things in the sky that even our military can't explain. Can you put that most recent flurry of activity around the UFO phenomena in the broader historical context you study?
Sure. I mean, it is a remarkable turn of events, because really from about, you'd say, the 2000 noughts up until that moment, interest in UFOs had fallen on hard times. I mean, even ufologists and UFO organizations, if you had talked to somebody back around, say, 2010, they would tell you that these are not the best of times, that their publications had all fallen by the wayside. Organizations couldn't get new members. There'd seem a loss of interest in the subject in the mainstream. So this ushers in a kind of a new wave of interest, not just within the UFO milieu and people who are interested in it, but in mainstream media. This again is part of really the story of UFOs. The things that oftentimes are seen as bringing newfound legitimacy to this subject are going to be mainstream media outlets talking about it, and or the interest of the U.S. government or other governments in the subject. And of course, this brought both of them. It brought major news outlets to get involved and to cover this story, combined with then ever more revelations on the part of military intelligence officials in the United States saying, hey, these things are genuine. These are things we think we need to look into. They are issues that are important to not only pilot safety, but national security. And so those two things combined really have allowed this to take off in a way we haven't seen for some time.
So today in 2024, what is the U.S. government, and including the political side of the legislative side of the government, the presidency, the military, and the intelligence community, what are all of them doing? And I realize the answer to this could be an entire show, but just briefly.
You got 3 minutes, Greg.
But we'll briefly, try to be as brief as I can.
Okay.
I think what we see are really a two-pronged sort of approach to this. One is intelligence in the military, right? They are always and always have been interested in national security issues. And the agency now responsible for this, that's been around since at least 2020, called AARO, has been issuing reports and investigating cases. A lot of it has focused primarily on military sightings and reports, but now they've expanded it over the years to civilian sightings as well. They have said time and again that there are areas that concern them, but they see no evidence that any of these things involve extraterrestrial intelligences. On the other hand, what you have is this civilian aspect of things through NASA. In many ways, I find NASA's interest in this subject much more interesting because it's unprecedented. NASA had always kept UFOs at arm's length over the years. And now in the past few years, NASA has looked into the subject, had appointed a civilian consultant committee to look into it, to decide whether this whether the phenomenon warranted research on the part of civilian scientists. They've said yes. So this seems to be a real change on the civilian side of things. And so we're really at a kind of a transition point at this stage in the game. It's not entirely clear where things go from here.
Do you see, part of the book describes the Academy's uncomfortable history with scientific research into the UFO phenomena. Given what you see happening with NASA, do you think that that's beginning to change in academic circles as well?
There's no question. I mean, there's a recent study showed that I think it's something in the neighborhood of well over 35 to 40% of academics believe the subject needs to be studied in one form or another. We also see all sorts of initiatives happening across not just the country, but the world, whether that's Avi Loeb, the Harvard astronomer who's been looking into the UFO phenomenon, or Hakan Kayal at the University of Würzburg in Germany, who's looking into it, and a new initiative out in California at Stanford. So there are a lot more people in academia who are approaching this subject, mind you, from lots of different perspectives, some from astronomy, some from physics, some from philosophy, some from history, right? But we seem to be experiencing and seeing a kind of a renaissance of interest in the subject within the academic universe.
Greg, 20 seconds and then we really have to go. Will the public ever get a full readout? Will we ever know the truth about UFOs?
I think UFOs are a mystery. They're not a riddle. They're not a puzzle. So they will always be with us. We're always going to be asking questions. And you could say maybe that's a good thing.
Greg Eghigian, the book is After the Flying Saucers Came, and it is a great read. That's all the time we have this week, but if you want to know more about storing the public square, you can find us on social media or visit pellcenter.org, where you can always catch up on previous episodes. For Wayne, I'm Jim, asking you to join us again next time for more Story in the Public Square.